Hello, everyone. My name is Holly Thompson. I am U.S. Preg Zero Waste Associate. I work on the Beyond Plastic campaigns along with our Whole Foods and fashion work. And I'll be your host for our webinar today. Yeah, to start out, I wanted to share some things that I have experienced this holiday season. So, this holiday season, I have tried to be more intentional with the gifts I'm getting different people. An example of this for my roommates, instead of getting them a bunch of different things for each of them, I decided to go all in on one gift for all of them that I thought would really bring them together, which is a karaoke machine. I'm really excited. I think it'll last longer and kind of bring our house together rather than just getting like them all individual stuff they don't need. And I've been trying to focus on getting people more experiences and things like that rather than just stuff they don't really need. So example is I got my best friend a mixology class that we're gonna go to together. And we're both really excited. And I got to ask her like which one she wanted to pick. And to me, kind of some of this stuff is more personalized to them rather than just getting them random stuff. So this is kind of the things I want to talk about today. Learning about what the zero waste economy can look like beyond bag bans and reusable water bottles, in a way that's beneficial for people. Yeah, because many people don't see plastic work beyond those kind of, oh, you can't bring a, okay, you can't use a plastic bag at the grocery store anymore. Yeah, because it's so much more than that. So, I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists so we can get started and ask you guys some questions. First we have Sam Pierce from the Story of Stuff, which is a nonprofit advocacy group working on reducing plastic waste at every part of its life cycle through community action. Sam is Story of Stuff lead campaigner, and he develops strategies harnessing the power of our community and digital media to end the single-use plastic era. He has an expertise in climate change, human rights, and plastics that allows him to run effective campaigns. So welcome. Next, we have Rini Saha, who co-owns Zero Waste Store Fulfillery in Tacoma Park, Maryland, which started in 2019 as a zero waste project. Fulfillery's mission is to shift our culture from a throwaway society to one where nothing is wasted and everything gets reused or transformed. She can be found all over DC and Maryland promoting her business. Next, we have Carly Verriger, who is a Remake community organizer for the DMV area. Remake is a nonprofit organization that advocates for human rights, fair pay, and sustainability within the fashion industry. Carly likes thrifting, upcycling, and educating others on sustainable habits they can have. She has also led protests at Levi stores in DMV during her time as a community organizer. So welcome guys. I'm really excited to have you all here to start this conversation about what it looks like to have zero waste beyond just the basic things you think of. Okay, so let me pull up these questions. So first I want you guys to talk a little about your organizations and what you do, just to give people general overview. So we'll start with Sam. Can you give us a brief overview of what Story of Stuff does and what is your theory of change?
Sure, and thanks for having me on, Holly. Great to be here with you all. So Story of Stuff is an organization. I think we ran over with a mission of transforming the kind of make use waste economy that's damaging the health of people and the planet, really. As an organization, we started off creating animated videos that showed the impact of a consumerist society and the cost of kind of this system that centers production and disposal, the impact on frontline and defense line communities, on the natural ecosystem, and ultimately on our kind of health and well-being overall, with a view to transforming that towards a more equitable, fair, and just world, really. So as part of that, we see storytelling as a powerful tool in our efforts to create new ideas, a new vision, a shared vision for the direction that we want to go in, and making something that you can imagine into something tangible. So we feel that the power of storytelling is kind of essential to the DNA of our organization, and imagining something better. And beyond that, we kind of connect narrative change and storytelling with examples of system change intervention that we identify with the help of our networked partners. We're a pretty small organization, so we collaborate extensively with different groups and networks about finding those really meaningful system change opportunities, whether that's through legislation, policy, corporate campaigning, and then attempt to use the power of story to connect people with these possibilities and ways for making change.
Great, that's awesome. Next we have Rini. Can you tell us about the Fulfillery and what role does it play in helping people live their zero waste lifestyles?
I like to think of us kind of like a temple almost for zero waste. People come find us and they are very, very concerned about trash and they have nowhere to go to find out the information and stuff like that. So I really do feel like sometimes we're like a church of zero waste. And we're a very organic organization. We were friends who were activists who knew more about sustainability than business, and threw money into a pot, and we've just grown slowly since then. And we didn't like take out a big loan, and so we were obligated. We could stay true to our vision because we didn't have these big expenses to pay. And so I think we do refills, soaps and detergents. We make our own soaps and detergents. We've invented products, like for instance, bring it in here. This is an example. This is a dish soap. It's a liquid dish soap because we do have the hard dish soaps also, but a lot of people just likes liquids. It's a problem. People just like liquids. So we decided we would have glass and put a concentrate in here, and then people could put it like just dump the concentrate into a jar and then add water, and then they would return this to us. They just return this to us, and that's that's at a cost for us, right? Because what happens is then we need to have labor to do this and sanitize it, and it's both time consuming and it is it's cost. It's much easier to buy virgin plastic. I mean, sorry, glass. In this case, it's glass. Sorry, glass, and it's also easier to buy virgin plastic. That's why a lot of these companies are doing that. Is that it's easier. It's just simply easier. It's less coordination. It's cheaper in the long run. We think if you calculate all the cost of the because you're not paying for the landfills much, comparatively, and so a lot of companies aren't motivated to do it, and we're doing it at a cost because we understand that that's the whole point of our business. We're doing it at a cost for ourselves, and so but we're trying. We're doing it anyway because even if it's harder, because this is the way that companies had to do it, whatever, like 70 or 80 years ago. Like Coca-Cola had to take it back because there wasn't landfills, weren't the national law yet, and beer companies took it back. Like there were places that you'd put your bottles back and they would just clean them. So I feel like we're bucking the system, and so that's our store in a nutshell. We are located in Tacoma Park, Maryland. If you're familiar with Tacoma Park, Maryland, we're across from the Ace Hardware store upstairs. We're only 2 feet away. We're literally only a block away from the DC border. But we, our struggle is expanding, because we kind of limit ourselves, I feel like, to the Maryland, DC, who's on this side, and so we have to think about, do we want to do delivery? What would that cost environmentally, if you want to outreach to more people, so anyway, that's our store in a nutshell.
Yeah, and I love it because it's a perfect example of like the responsibility being on the producer to like do good and reduce their waste rather than the consumer, because it's can be difficult to do that. So next to Carly, the question is, what does Remake do and how do you guys promote sustainable fashion?
Yeah, so when you introduced me, you said how Remake is a global advocacy organization who fights for environmental justice and fair pay in the fashion industry. And that sounds really big. And we have kind of a multi-pronged attack when it comes to those issues. So in terms of fighting for fair pay and safe working conditions, we'll engage with large fashion brands in the industry. So for instance, when hundreds of brands canceled orders in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, all these factories in the global south had the products ready and completed. However, the brands canceled the orders and didn't pay any of them. And so one of the things that Remake did is we were able to recover $22 billion worth of stolen wages for those garment workers. So that's just kind of an example of how we really aim to hold these brands accountable. And if they're not going to have ethical business practices, we are going to do our best to ensure that the garment workers who are making their clothes still can have the wages that they were promised. But wages is not necessarily enough because, as I said, we're promoting fair pay, and garment workers are not paid fairly right now. So we have a few initiatives. We're working on the International Accord right now, which is ensuring safe working conditions in Bangladesh. And it's about to be expanded to Pakistan is the hope. So we are working to just get governments on board with this, to get brands on board with this accord. And then within the United States, we are also working on something called the Fabric Act that's working its way through Congress right now. And I know when consumers oftentimes buy products with kind of a made in USA label, they tend to take pride in the fact and think that that product was made ethically, with living wages, with safe working environments. And that's not actually the case. The United States does have sweatshops here. And so the Fabric Act is kind of a way to, once again, hold brands accountable and to ensure an actual minimum wage being instated across the United States. So that's kind of our fair wage, safe working conditions prong. And then we also have our environmental justice in the fashion industry. And the fashion industry is a major polluter. 4% of global carbon emissions are from the fashion industry. The largest US supplier for apparel, China, 70% of their waterways are contaminated with textile waste and dye because of the textile industry. So it's a very big problem. And so one of the things that we believe is that if we begin to start paying people fairly, ensuring safe working conditions, it will slow the industry down. So we are looking at kind of a degrowth type of model, where rather than supporting fast fashion brands, consumers begin to form kind of more emotional connections to the items in their wardrobe. Actual human hands made these items. Machines don't make our clothes. So making the items in your wardrobe last longer, buying secondhand, things don't have to be new to have value. Having items that were once treasured by someone else can be very impactful and very meaningful. So kind of getting consumers to rethink their relationship with their wardrobes is another thing that we fight for. So that is kind of a brief overview of Remake.
Thanks so much for that. And I love Remake. They've been great partners with us on the fashion fight. Okay, so Sam, can you go into a little detail on why it's so important to turn off the tap and stop the production of plastic upstream?
Yeah, it's I think it goes without saying that many of us are obviously very familiar with the impacts of plastic and the many kind of external costs associated with the production of plastic. I mean, we are talking about estimates of around 12 million tons of plastic entering the ocean each year. The essential problem with plastics is that we don't know what to do with them once we're done, and they just break down into smaller and smaller pieces. And so, with that in mind, the smaller that those pieces break down into, the less that they're able to be managed or controlled in any way. And so we're now understanding that we're not any longer talking about just microplastics, but nanoplastics. We have particles so small that they've now been found inside unborn human placenta. thin enough to get through walls of our organs, things like that. So that, you know, and we're finding traces of plastics in precipitation, rain, snow. So, you know, this could not be any more urgent as far as, you know, the health of our planet is concerned, as far as the many people who live alongside the entire kind of life cycle of plastics and who are harmed at every phase of that cycle. So it's really important. And so the obvious answer then, if we don't really know what to do with it, is to make less of it, right? And so, you know, typically it's good to have different types of kind of representatives on the call today from different perspectives, because plastic has many facets and is being used in lots of different industries. We've tended to focus a little more, as have many others, on things like packaging, because it's the most visible part of the problem. It's approximately sort of 40% of plastic production goes into kind of primary and secondary packaging. But there are many other issues, you know, fashion, as Carly's pointed out, is a major and growing issue, a major source, as are others. So, you know, with that in mind, our pathway right now is unsustainable, and unfortunately, it's, you know, it's without major interventions, it is set to get worse before it gets better. In that, you know, plastic is very visible already, but over the next kind of couple of decades, we're looking at doubling or tripling production of plastics in the US alone. And that really can't be allowed to happen. You know, we have to limit and draw down the expansion of the petrochemical industry in the United States and globally. So I think there's one other important point here to be made, which is, you know, plastics and fossil fuels are often seen about and spoken about in different spaces, separate spaces, but they do originate from the same source. You know, plastics are made from fossil fuels. And one of the interesting dynamics that we saw going into the pandemic was, all of a sudden there was this sort of huge supply reduction in demand, for some of the things like gas and typical fossil fuel usage. And we were seeing that it was sort of really hurting the bottom line of a number of the kind of the companies associated with extraction and selling hydrocarbons. But they are oftentimes the same companies that are producing and selling and manufacturing plastics. And so what we saw is rapidly this kind of attempt to pivot to ensure that there wasn't any kind of adverse effect from an industry perspective on the amount of plastic being used, and real attempts to associate single-use plastic with hygienic kind of practices, which turned out to be, you know, it was really a constructed narrative. There wasn't really any much kind of weight behind it. But all is to say that the fate of plastics and fossil fuels are tied. And so I think it's really important that you know, that we prevent those things being produced in the same way. Increasingly, plastics are being seen as this sort of escape hatch for the fossil fuel industry. So we cannot simply, as we're lowering our demand on fossil fuels, we cannot allow those same hydrocarbons simply to be moved into plastics. And that's why we really need to start with a reduction perspective, first of all, thinking about that waste hierarchy, right? And then moving into other kinds of solutions after that.
Yeah, that's such a good point with the fossil fuels and finding plastic everywhere. One of the perspectives Perg takes is plastic doesn't just affect the environment, but also it affects our health through how it's used and every part of the life cycle, whether you're near the factories or just get the general effects of them burning and using oil. So yeah. Rini, my next question for you is why did you decide to start your business and why is zero waste important to you?
Well, I actually was professionally a teacher most of my adult career, and I wanted to always encourage civic participation of my kids. And the school that I was working at actually stopped doing recycling. And so I was incensed, because I was bringing plastic in every day to eat my lunch, and I even bought plastic forks and knives. So I was a different person before, to for this, the teacher's lounge, because I thought I was being nice to my fellow teachers, and I just didn't, and so then when I did that project, I didn't want it to just be like, hey, put this stuff in the blue bin or let's get the blue bins up. I wanted to actually learn what was happening with recycling. And the more I read about it, it sounded kind of fake. And I never knew that. And that opened my eyes up and made me more interested in sustainability because I don't, in American education, sustainability is really not taught. And so there's a lot of things I just didn't know, that I know now after, this was happened 7 years ago that became more interested in sustainability and moved away from education. But, it should be a requirement that students learn about sustainability because unless you just take an independent interest, a lot of people, I didn't actually even know before 7 years ago that plastic was made from petroleum. As silly as that sounds, but I wasn't the only one. And that's, when people talk about sustainability, they often are just thinking electric cars and solar panels, right? And because most people don't learn a lot about sustainability, so that's just all they know. And so I think it's very important if you really want plastic to end. What we always do in the store is also educate people. We always, ask them, where does plastic come from? And you'll be surprised even when people walk in the store, how many times, even though they're interested in reducing the plastic, they don't know that plastic's made from petroleum. They don't know that plastic, you can't really recycle it. They've never heard the word circular economy, so when a circular economy is a more common word than recycling, I think you'll see, because all things have to start with the public, right? Like public policy is always influenced by public opinion. And what these corporations do is they try to put recycling in so no one has to learn anything else about the plastic pollution problem. And so there's a lot of people protesting, a lot of people protest about climate change, but if you don't educate people, they don't know. I mean, that doesn't make much of a difference. If most people don't know that plastic is made from petroleum, protesting that you're changing policy is going to be very ineffective. So but anyway, that goes back to me. That's how I got interested in it. But and so then it's been a slow process. When we started 3 years ago, we were like farmers markets, and we just took a few products that were already being made, that were already with the circular economy in mind, and there weren't that many back then. And the good thing is like 3 years later, I would say we have doubled the vendors. So I do think the cultural needle is moving the right direction. I don't think it's gotten to its cultural tipping point, and just we are very committed to our mission. Like I said, I could be a teacher, but instead I'm doing this. So if I'm choosing to do this, I'm going to be authentic about it, right? And so we really do sit there and think about, even if it's a cost to us, and that's the problem. Most businesses won't do it if it's a cost to them. We will try to reuse our products, and we always our logo in here is we take back all the packaging, anything that's compostable. We don't take all your compost, but we'll take the compost that we produce. If you don't have a compost bin, we always try to tell that to people, that we'll take back because we want to make sure our products don't end up in a landfill because that's why we produce them, the ones that we make ourselves, so yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And it's really through like an interest that even if you don't know where to start in this zero waste movement, you can always like, if you're interested, you can find out how to get involved. And I love that you guys just had a passion about it, so you went and did it. So next question's for Carly. Can you explain why it's so important to transition to slow fashion and some of the typical consumption habits during the holidays?
Certainly, yeah. I do want to add on to something that Sam and Rini both mentioned about plastic being in everything too. Yeah, like everything that gives any of our clothing items any sort of stretch is generally made of plastic and oil as well. So like your yoga pants, like acrylic, spandex, polyester, like all of that is plastic. And yeah, I'm sure so much of Sam's work, like every time we wash all of those items, like they shed microplastics. And they do make guppy bags and things like that that you can put in the wash, but I hadn't heard nanoplastics until this call. So I don't necessarily know if those guppy bags protect against nanoplastics. But yeah, all these things, enter our waterways. And then are kind of, then we're able to re-ingest them into our bodies. So it is very scary, and it seeps its way into all parts of our life. Yeah, and so to answer your question about slow fashion, one, for the environment, obviously the things I mentioned before, just about slowing down the production and then reusing articles of clothing more than we are kind of, the culture generally is used to, maybe making them last longer. So I feel like we've fallen into a habit of constantly buying more things than we're done with it, donating it and feeling good about it. And that's actually not as sustainable as we think it is. Only 10% of the items that you might donate to a large organization like Goodwill or Salvation Army actually enter your local economy again. The vast majority of them are shipped across to the global south, and are made to be someone else's problem. And the global south doesn't need all of our like clothes and all of our like bachelorette t-shirts. They really don't. And so we kind of need to think about, whenever we're investing in an item of clothing, how long it's actually going to last in our closet. Is it going to last one day? That's not a reason for someone to make that garment at all. Clothing should be lasting much longer than a day. And so I think during the holidays, we kind of have tricked ourselves into just buying things to buy. It's what everyone does. And I think that we just have kind of made ourselves feel good about it, whether it's something that the gift recipient might want or not. So I think when people tell you that they want something, or they give you a list, buy something from that list. I think that it's easy, or sometimes we can see something and be like, oh my gosh, I saw this and I just thought of you, and I just thought you could use it. And that's very thoughtful, but a lot of times that person might not actually want that item. Also, when people give me an Amazon wish list, I try to source it from elsewhere. So if someone gives me an Amazon wish list full of books, I'll go to my local bookstore and get a book. And they can normally get any book that you want within 3 or 4 days. So it's kind of a nice way to still get the person something they want, but not supporting a massive brand that doesn't need any more money. So things like that. Also, if someone tells you they don't want something, or they don't want anything for the holidays, don't buy them anything. They are not saying that just to come across a certain way. They really don't want anything. And so I think that we need to turn away from this culture of amassing things for others and for ourselves that we don't actually need for the holidays. There are so many other lovely things about the holidays, and consumption doesn't really have to be one of them. We can take consumption out of the holidays, and holidays can still be way enjoyable. So that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. My grandmother is a little bit addicted to online shopping. So I tried to ask her, I didn't have a bed frame in my new house I'm renting. So I tried to ask her for that, something I actually needed, instead of like all like the random piles of like clothes wrapped in plastic. She would have got me. Let's hope it works. Yeah, so next question is for Sam. We see a lot of excess wrapping in deliveries in stores this time of year. How can companies reduce the amount of plastic they use, and what are some examples of successes of businesses doing this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, it's difficult to overgeneralize, because companies all have such different kind of USPs and are trying to do different things. So I think the first thing is to really look at, what is it that your company is trying to do? Maybe do a little, map out how it is that, if you're in the business of selling products, understanding where they come from, how they get there, and see whether there are opportunities to cut out some of the unnecessary packaging. I think one of the things that we sometimes don't see is there's the kind of primary packaging that gets products from one business to another business, and actually there's at least as much packaging waste before we actually even see any consumer goods as when we actually see them ourselves. So that's the first one, is the other ways to build reusables, not just into consumer facing applications, but businesses as well. You know, you think of things like that you probably never would think of, as like what all these massive shipping pallets and stuff that are being used to load products. Those things can be reused. Those things could be recycled, repurposed. So that's, you know, maybe one. Second of all is like thinking about what are you stocking? You know, the issue of kind of overstock is significant. So, you know, using models to be as accurate as possible in terms of, I suppose, predicting demand and not, you know, not overstocking. I think the other one that's particularly kind of visible in around this year, and generally really over the last couple of years, since the kind of the advent of the pandemic, is e-commerce, right? As we see so much stuff getting shipped, you know, people like getting things delivered and shipped these days, and so really thinking whether there is a more, you know, circularity that can be designed into that system. So we produced, StoryStuff produced a mini series recently called Solving Plastics, looking at some of the kind of new models emerging in the space, and one of them was just the idea of a reusable shipping mailer. So these being, you know, upcycled, and then once they've been received, you can just fold them and return them with it's got, you know, the stamp on it, so it gets mailed back to the store right away. So let's think about like reuse for e-commerce as well. And then also, as far as e-commerce is concerned, you know, there's so much of that so secondary and tertiary packing, things like plastic air pillows and packaging peanuts and all of that stuff. There are alternatives emerging now. Let's explore them. Let's look at those. I know that I think IKEA is using sort of like mycelium packaging. So this is procured and produced from mushrooms. So let's look at these kind of alternatives and try to help scale them.
Yeah, that's some great ideas in there. And Rini, I want you to add on to this conversation and kind of talk about how businesses can use like the refill model that you have too.
Yeah, I mean, the refill model is it's more exciting today than when we started. I mean, first of all, we make our own. I can show you our refill station right here. We make our own things, so that cuts down on plastic waste, and we do things locally. So I think localization has a lot to do with being able, because when you ship liquids, when you ship a lot of things, you can't ship it without plastic. And can you reuse the plastic? I think that's a fair point. But you know, and a lot of things are coming over on these cargo ships, and those cargo ships, every ship in the world will always get water in it. So what they do is they put plastic over everything. Now, do they need to put it individually on each thing? I don't know. That's what, even the zero waste stuff comes to us sometimes, and we have to call those companies up and be like, why did you put plastic over your thing? They're like, well, this came from India. So it's kind of like, you know, and so I'm always a little shocked because I don't completely understand the supply chain myself, and I understand more than most people because those companies don't have to disclose it, but I just know it because we are calling these companies up and trying to learn their supply chain, and so that is I think keeping it local, but you know that is hard in a very globalized world now, a very globalized world, to convince people to be very local. I mean, I think, and also the other thing is just living in DC. I'm very aware of how much like the American Chemistry Council is one of the biggest lobbying group here in DC. I would, you know, I think, you know, having, you know, and there's companies like Nestle that aren't even American that are paying into these. And, I would question these companies on how much money are you actually making? They believe that they're making money. It's sort of like advertising. They don't actually know how much money they're making, but they think it's more important to spend their money on lobbying dollars rather than making their product sustainable, and
Actually,
stopping
so,
the.
like, I don't know if you guys have ever read a book called The Waste Free World. It came out pretty recently. It's about the circular economy and like the economic benefits of having a sustainable and circular economy. And I would actually recommend it to all of you because it covers like food and plastic and clothes and stuff like that. And since it's really recent, I found it to be like super relevant. But what were you saying?
My point is that these companies, they will do anything to keep this old system up.
Oh, so it's not really the manufacturers that are against the sustainability. Like,
Oh, okay.
so manufacturers want their stuff back. Like the aluminum producers, they want their stuff back. The glass producers, they also want their stuff back because it's now becoming more and more expensive for them because there's starting to be more like producer responsibility laws coming into effect. So like the materials are getting more expensive. So the people that are actually against this is usually the local governments because they make money from waste removal and recycling and stuff like that. So I found that the people who are making a huge fuss is not necessarily like the manufacturers. Like Coca-Cola and Pepsi and Starbucks have all donated hundreds of millions of dollars to sustainable efforts, like making compostable cups and like making their bottles and their packaging. Like Coca-Cola wants to change their plastic bottles to be like made with plant plastic and stuff, and they're spending like hundreds of millions of dollars on this a year. So I don't think it's the manufacturers really that are against this. Like the materials are now getting to a point where it's getting to be really scarce. So they're looking into sustainable options because they don't have any other options. It's becoming significantly more expensive.
They're paying a lot of money. I mean, I'm sorry. But they are paying a lot of money into these lobbying groups, and I would also encourage them. I would also throw them
playing
into
both sides.
I think they're playing both sides, just like
Yeah.
a lot of these political places who donate to both the Republicans and Democrats. I think they also have not. I mean, to rebuild an entire system is very difficult when they already have a system in place. So, and I think some of that stuff. I don't know. I saw the Dasani water bottle that is made from Coca-Cola, and the other day, and it said 100% recycled plastic. Like that's highly unlikely.
No, that's what I'm saying. They're literally spending hundreds of millions of dollars into making those things. Like they're trying to develop
Well,
those products.
anyway, but just to finish my point, I mean, I would just encourage these companies to disclose who they're giving money to. I mean, these lobbying groups, because why spend any penny on these lobbying groups? They all have represented. If they all stopped, and spent more than that money towards sustainability, I think it would have been better use. Why spend any money towards I think it's just an unfair use of our society and our dollars. So, because these lobbying groups are stopping a lot of these things, stopping reuse, stopping those things. So, and also the laws are really prevent us sometimes from being, for instance, in DC, you can't just a lot of things prevent you from using reused things, and because they think it's not sanitary. I also think it needs to be on the consumer. If they're bringing in a bottle, I mean, it's true, we need to make sure that they sanitize it. We don't mind educating them to make sure they're sanitizing at the right level.
Bottles specifically,
Yeah.
like they're so like with glass bottles, they aren't really designed to be properly sanitized. They're like the neck is too narrow. So like in Oregon, what they do is they actually have designed a bottle that has a neck wide enough for them to take back the bottles and reuse them. So they have, I think, a couple million beer bottles in circulation with like local breweries. So like glass is actually a really good example of this because it's technically like infinitely recyclable, but it takes a lot of energy to even get it recycled. And the way that we recycle glass in the States is really bad. So it actually ends up contaminating a lot of other properly recyclable materials like aluminum and paper. So things like designing like mycelium packages and making bottles to have slightly larger necks and stuff like that. Like that's, I guess, the law says that you need it to be sanitary. So like the problem is not necessarily the law, it's like the design of the bottle, because it should be wide enough to be reused. Because if
Right,
you
but
can
I-
reuse glass, you
I
can do
understand
it,
what you're
like,
saying, but I
50
was talking about just the
times.
laws, just not preventing it, the reuse business from popping up, right? Because that also
Yeah, the
ultimately should
health
be on
code.
the person that they sanitize bottles well enough, or maybe they don't feel that uncomfortable. Like, I'm not a germaphobe, so I don't feel that uncomfortable even when the neck's not that good. So I'm fine
Right, but
with
from like a manufacturing standpoint, like if they were manufacturing bottles with necks of a certain wideness,
Right.
and then you could sanitize that properly on like a level, I think that's the reason that that law is like that. Because like leaving it to normal people, like if you're at a restaurant, if you're manufacturing, if you're like Coca-Cola and you're using bottles,
I mean,
you should be able to
we could
sanitize
debate why the
them.
laws are there. I think the laws are there because people have a true belief that disposability is better. Like, when when my children went to daycare, many daycares wouldn't do the cloth diapers and they thought it was unsanitary. And so I finally found a daycare that did. And I think that as a parent, I should have the right to go to any daycare. I think it should be law that every daycare takes the cloth diapers, rather than the opposite. So I really, and I think that a lot of daycares are afraid that they're going to get hit by the law, with the cloth diapers. So I do think that we need a cultural switch on the idea of reusables. But also the laws need to make it easy for these refill stations to pop up. And of course, as local as you can make the economy would be the best. And I also think that you got to get these manufacturers to, even if I also think that they need to stop spending so much money on lobbying and moving more towards sustainability. So anyway, that's my opinion. Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. I'm gonna ask Carly one more question, and then I do wanna go back to that conversation about laws and what federal, state, and like local governments can do to like promote zero waste. So Carly, how do you think the fashion industry will transition to a circular or more circular economy? And what are some of the easiest things they could do, and what are some of the most challenging things they have to overcome?
My answer might lead into your next question about laws, because one thing has become quite clear after various catastrophes have happened in the fashion industry, like with Rana Plaza collapsing in 2013, which killed 1,200 people, 1,200 garment workers. The fashion industry does not regulate itself. One of the only things we are seeing that encourages them to regulate themselves is laws and them having to follow laws. So I think that, unfortunately, that is one of the things that we're going to have to focus on, is that we can have sustainable practices as consumers, but also as consumers, we have to advocate different laws and policies that are going to hold these brands accountable to the environment and to the workers themselves. For instance, in California in September of this year, in terms of drinking water, they just passed a law that it was a requirement for drinking water to be tested for these microplastics, because we're still not fully certain of the effects these microplastics have on humans who are ingesting them time and time again. And I believe in New York in November, on their recent election, they had a similar bill that was introduced as well. So I think what we need to do is make links between microplastics, the fashion industry using, plastics in their manufacturing. And once we are able to study the effects of these microplastics, then we can create laws the fashion industry can then abide by. Similarly, there is a new law around greenwashing terminology in the fashion industry. They're learning that consumers, we like to hear about the buyback programs they might have and the post-consumer recycled bottles that they're using in their products, but there is not really a lot of teeth behind these claims that they're making. Yeah. And so there are laws that are beginning to be instated that if you're going to claim that you are sustainable, that you are using this material, if you are limiting your water usage in the production of your products, that is actually having an impact on the clothing. And I think it also means, similar to what Rini was saying, is that consumers have to be educated. We can't just kind of like be buying all these plastic things. We have to educate ourselves about if brands are really doing what they're saying they're doing. And it can be kind of hard to do. Remake does post a fashion accountability report every year, where we examine 58 fashion brands for their traceability, their wages and well-being, their commercial practices, raw materials, environmental justice, and governance. And so we have a scale, and we rate major brands from Uniqlo to Abercrombie and Fitch to H&M to Target, where they stand on all these various criteria. So it's kind of a resource that users can, or that consumers can use to figure out if the brands they're buying from kind of have ethical practices when it comes to these various terms. But to sum up, it will be laws, and it will be the fashion industry following laws that we have to create, that will create the change. So it's, and it's consumers advocating for these laws as well. So we have to really want serious change and not just lip service to sustainability.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the fashion industry is one of like the least regulated industries out there. So I think there's like a lot of space for these things to happen. So Sam, I know Story of Stuff works at a variety of different levels. What are some general laws that you would think would progress this circular economy throughout like the life cycle of stuff and reducing its impact?
Yeah, I think important question, Holly. And I think there's some discussion, Renee, with you and your colleague on this. I think there is this whole layer that sits behind the corporate practices that we see that determines or doesn't determine what we end up getting, how we get our stuff packaged. So one example is just the concept that is completely ordinary to us now, but the idea that packaging is advertising space. It is designed to be an advert. That is so problematic on a couple of fronts. In that, we mentioned, for example, the refillable bowls in Oregon. So we did a feature piece on that. So there are around a dozen breweries that are using a single standardized glass bottle, and the only way that's that was achievable in that in order to create the scale and standardization was to do the difficult work of coming together with these different companies and saying, hey, we want to use the same bottle. So there's a lot of kind of inertia around things like that, because there's this idea and belief that we need to distinguish ourselves all the time from competitors. But maybe we need to think about more like cooperative spaces for companies to operate in. So I think of companies like Rini's and others that are trying to build sustainable practices, and I think we need to see those kind of like level of standardization and support for companies that want to do good things. Like, so there's examples of the name is actually escaping me right now, but there's a group in California that basically provides startup funds for restaurants that want to do that need to upfront the costs of dishwasher facilities, things like that tend to pay themselves back in the long run. They're not necessarily more expensive over the long run, but it's those initial startup costs. So I think we need to move towards more comprehensive laws that address things like greenwashing, standardization, that ultimately the fundamental issue with plastics is that there is no cost associated with unsustainability, right? There's no cost to using as much plastic as you want, right? But there is a huge external cost that we are all carrying the burden of. So what we need is laws that are basically internalizing those costs again and making it more cost effective, hopefully, for the companies to adopt more sustainable practices. And a lot of the time that's about It's about the laws you have in place initially, and then that creates the scale and the opportunity to do other things. If I would, I'd just pick up one other point, which is, maybe a little more of a difficult concept, or one that we're going to have to reflect on or think about, is like, you go back 100 years and it was Coca-Cola bottlers who were the ones who were paying like deposits on bottles so they could get them back and wash them and reuse them. And then you get to the 1960s and basically you transition towards the aluminum can, and it's cheaper for them not to take them back, so they transition to one-way containers. But I think the mistake, the risk from where we go from right now, is that we just look to replicate the systems that we already have with reusables and stuff like that, which in theory that's great, but I guess this is my me throwing my weight behind companies like Rinnies, which is like, ultimately I do think we need to be transitioning towards more decentralized economy. Not everything should be huge companies shipping stuff over the world. And so I think part of the way we look at supply chains and all of that, ultimately we're going to have to probably decentralize some of the way that these supply chains operate, and create less dependence around things that need to be traveling halfway around the world. There is crazy examples. This is not even a packaging one, but I remember, so I'm from the UK originally, hearing that like apples grown near where I lived were being sent to South Africa to get the kind of the sheen, the like shiny sheen that they have on top of the apples, and then shipped back for consumption. And that's because of the kind of economies of scale and systems that we have in place. But we need to build decentralized systems, and that to some extent will dictate some of our packaging needs and reduce those packaging needs, I think, right?
Yeah, I love what you said about having companies internalize the externality, because right now they're just like putting it into the world and having other people deal with it. And the decentralization, definitely a big thing about the circular economy. Rini, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what local governments could do to help support zero waste businesses like yours, and what you would like to see from things like the DC government, places like the DC government.
I touched on some of it with just like stopping the laws that are stopping like there is this belief in our community that disposable is cleaner, more is better for you, but that doesn't take into account that a lot of these things are made with chemicals that we don't know what the long-term costs are. And I mean, that is really ultimately the problem, is that we can't really completely prove it, but we know that there is a cost, that we know that people are getting cancer at younger and younger ages. So, but we don't really know. So, but I think, so like I said, like when I was trying to find a daycare that would use use cloth diapers, it was, a lot of daycares were scared that they're going to get in trouble for using cloth diapers, because it might not be sanitary or something like that. And, I think, as a parent, if I'm taking on that risk, then that should be me, you know what I mean? As a consumer, you're not trusting me, and I know that, for instance, when my kids go to a trampoline park, it's like common for people to go to birthday parties and trampoline parks, they make us sign a waiver that, like, I've taken on the risk. I understand that my kid might get hurt and has to go to the emergency room, but I understand I'm not going to sue you, and I think that would help a lot, because I know that my soap maker doesn't want to do a refill station with like lotion and stuff like that, because she worries that the people won't sanitize their container enough, where, like, right now our refill station is mostly soaps. I mean, that is sanitizing it, because soap's a sanitizer, so we don't have to worry about that as much. So, we do worry on our end, we don't want to get in trouble. So we do want that risk. And, and when you do the right thing and you bring in your own container to a restaurant, they give you a hard time because they're worried about cross-contamination. So, I mean, I understand that in the food industry, but if they really, if they had to go like the standardized packaging, what Sam says, like, why do we have so many different types of packaging? I think this would cut down on the being able to rewash it. If everybody just agreed to use a to-go box that didn't have to have your advertising space on it. A lot of them, it's like, so then everybody would know where to return them. They could have them throughout the cities. It could be another bin, without the city. So I think the local governments can invest. They can gather all the restaurants together. They could help incentivize this business. They could start, like for an example like that, so I think that's, help maybe be a gathering place for these microbreweries that are using the same beer bottle essentially, and, maybe be a gathering place, but also make the laws easier and let the consumer take on the risk that they want to take on. So I would say those things.
Could I ask a question? So, I'm part of a nonprofit. It's kind of on hiatus right now, but our aim was to like reduce single use bottle waste in the DMV area. So there's not many states that have a bottle bill, but in the states that do, like, do you guys know what a bottle bill is? Okay, cool. So you basically like put like 10 cents down when you buy like a drink or something, and then you can return it and stuff like that. There's only 10 states that currently have that sort of law. So our nonprofit's goal was to get a bill passed to help get that started. But there seems to be like issues between people trying to pass producer responsibility laws and bottle bills at the same time. They apparently contradict each other. And then you also—
How do they contradict each other?
Because if you're having producer responsibility laws, there's something about like it, like this is the part that I don't really understand. I don't understand why they conflict, because
I can speak to this a little if it's helpful. I think
uh-huh.
basically the reason that bottle bills, like, they go back to the 1970s, and they sort of exist because the beverage containers were disproportionately found as like littered items. So that's kind of like the thinking behind. It was like originally a litter reduction measure, and then with the EPR, extended producer responsibility laws that are coming in, they are much broader and are more about transforming recycling. So it's the idea that producers are paying, are shouldering more of the cost burden of the end of life management of the materials, and this typically applies to products across the system. That often the shortcoming with these systems is that they don't go in far enough to incentivize companies to really rethink the design element of the production. So it's more just transitioning the cost from the consumer to the producer, which is a good start, but isn't necessarily enough to really push the companies to think like, oh, can we design circular systems? So sometimes the companies prefer to see the EPR laws. We tend to advocate that you do both. And you have, typically with bottle bills, they have higher, you can have higher recycling targets or recycling rates. The other thing is that there's more recycled content going into those bottles, and a lot of that comes from the fact that you have a completely separate stream of materials from the bottle bill, so it doesn't get some of the contamination that ends up from the curbside process. So basically, I think the idea is to have like higher collection rates and recycling targets for a bottle bill. They tend to be a bit watered down if it's just inside an EPR bill.
Yeah, it seemed like the thing about bottle bills is it pertains strictly to like bottles, whereas like EPR bills would also be like tin cans and like mason jars and stuff like that. But in Kansas, they actually are collecting glass, but in a different way. So instead of having a bottle bill, it's basically, I think, like a nonprofit system, and they just have these purple bins everywhere, and then they just kind of have people throwing the all of their glass. So whether it's a pasta jar or whether it's like a beer bottle or anything, it's all going into this purple bin. But it was started by a brewery, and then they got local partners in the area, and now it's grown to be more than just Kansas City. So like they've got trucks that'll go to like Chicago and like kind of out in like that Midwest area. So we were trying to see if chasing this idea of like reducing bottle and just like waste if it was more effective to chase the legislation way, which they say would take like years. Then you have all like the EPA, like the producer responsibility stuff like tangled within that. Like I was in talks with the Sierra Club, and she was saying that like they're trying to make producer responsibility laws at the same time they're trying to pass bottle bill laws, but the likelihood of either one of them getting passed is really difficult because you have both and they kind of contradict each other in certain ways. So they were saying like the legislation going that route could be effective, but it will take years, whereas the Kansas City way, they're kind of doing it in a more grassroots local business like bootstrap kind of way, and it seems to be effective like immediately. So I think that's the hard part about legislation. Like it takes
Yeah,
years and
yeah.
years,
And it may not be enforced.
and it may not be enforced. Like the assembly's
Right.
only in session for so long. So even though we know that this is like a long process, it's kind of like, is it worth only chasing the legislation when
yeah.
we don't exactly know what's going to happen, or do we do it
The culture.
ourselves and
Yeah.
yeah, with like the businesses and like the innovators and chase that end of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think
Yeah.
that's true. I think a lot of environmentalists only pursue policy and don't pursue culture aggressively enough.
I think I've seen it both
Yeah.
ways. I've seen people only pursue the culture aspect, and then I've seen people only pursue the law aspect. But I feel like to really hit both the population and policy, like there needs to be some way to like commingle both together.
I
Yeah,
agree.
but I think a majority, I would say a lot of the nonprofits that are focusing, maybe not yours, but a lot of the nonprofits that are focusing on environment are often just trying to remove legislation. Like, you know, I don't, I mean, you can speak to
Mhm.
that, Holly, since you work at Break Free Plastic.
Yeah.
But
So
Well, I think things like this
first
are
of
really
all-
helpful.
Oh, yeah. First of all, I just want to say, the bottle bill is some of the first legislation that PERG actually like organized around. It was like we started in Massachusetts with the bottle bill, and that was like our original campaign we were working on. And now we do both EPR in a lot of different states and also bottle bills. But how you're talking about different like federal legislation and state legislation versus the grassroots stuff, I think it's really important to look at each state individually and what each state would want in their legislature and what would work best for them. Like, we pursued EPR in Colorado with our state office there, but we're not necessarily gonna do the same thing in Georgia when they don't even have like plastic bag bans or stuff like that. It just depends on the state and what you can do in the state. But yeah, PERG does a lot of campaigning. We do a lot of organizing, going door to door, asking people to support this kind of stuff. But we also do stuff on the state and federal level. And I think more organizations are trying to do that with their chapters and different state offices and things like that because they see how slow things are taken at the federal level. So they're trying to start to do stuff at the state and chapter level too. So
but I think I think her point was though, Holly, was not to like kind of just does PERG go from door to door to businesses, do you know what I'm saying, rather than just legislators, because they're not the only ones making decisions, you know what I'm saying? And I think what her point was is that culturally you're only attacking these you know, and in the end of the day you don't know if they're going to enforce it. You know, there's a lot of laws that are not being enforced all day long. You know, it's what's popular and what's not, you know. And you know, just because we have a Clean Air Act in the United States, it wasn't really enforced during the Bush years, and then it was during the Obama years, and then the Trump years, I don't know, they probably edited those laws. But, you know, so I mean, you know, laws are, you know, again, you know, policy is just only one way to attack things. So I'd be curious if PERG would be willing to do door to door to the businesses and talk to them, because oftentimes they're not educated about where their trash is going or how to compost. They get worried about it. And so then you could hear their concerns, because like in Tacoma, we actually, you know, Tacoma Park is very green. If you are from the DC area, you would know that. And they have these like to-go boxes, just Tacoma Park restaurants, but like our restaurant that's next to our store refuses to do it because they don't want cross-contamination. But you're not hearing those words if you're just talking to legislators and not to the businesses. So I think that also talking to the businesses is very important when doing advocacy work.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Perg does a lot of campaigns with bigger businesses. Like we have a not Perg, but one of our sister organizations does like their stakeholder work and getting stakeholder agreements and voting. I forget how it works exactly, but they do stuff with that. And I know Story of Stuff is trying to highlight local businesses through their YouTube series, and it's something I'm trying to do as the Zero Waste Associate, like bring you guys on board and not only do, and that's why everyone here is like at a different organization at a different level, right? Like Remake does a lot of like international advocacy. And you guys are a local business, so I try to like get all the different levels to try and come together and imagine what we can do in the future. I just want you guys to go through and just say one or two things that the average person, I know we talked a lot about the fashion, but one or two things the average person can do to reduce their waste and consumption habits. So whoever wants to start.
I thought about this in the context of the kind of the holiday season and gifting and all that. And I don't know. I feel like I'm noticing a general kind of shift in people's attitudes around this, and a recognition of overconsumption in general, at least in my circles. So I think you know, an in-kind gift or an experience or making something is one of the more thoughtful things you can do for people. And I think although maybe like there may be some like historical kind of cultural taboos around this stuff, it's probably not the right word, but you know, ways of creating a culture of expecting consumer products. I think this can be a really meaningful alternative this for the holiday period. So yeah.
I can go next. I thought of some, if you have any sort of like crafting abilities, I guess I'm thinking in terms of fashion as well. That's kind of where my answer is rooted. But like if you can embroider or mend or sew or tailor, I think as opposed to like gifting a friend something new, if they have something in their wardrobe that like could use a second life, or yeah, like doesn't quite fit them, if you have the ability to tailor a garment for friends, like you can give that as a gift. Like that's you breathing new life into an item that maybe they didn't yeah, that they've kind of fallen out of love with. So that's a great way to kind of give a gift in that sense. Also, if you have any friends who are kind of curious about darning or mending themselves, there are so many classes that you can gift online, and the tools to complete these things are readily available, both new and secondhand. And it's not, I think people are also intimidated by upcycling, or even like sewing on buttons. Like sewing on a button is a super easy basic skill that anyone can learn. And like you can learn that skill, and you can, any of those loose buttons you have, you can sew those onto your clothes and make those clothes more functional. And then also just supporting, kind of along with the decentralization topic we were talking about, there's so many innovative people in this industry who are like upcycling and using like vintage tea towels to make jumpsuits, and people who are using old kind of like fuzzy beach towels to make beach hats. Like people are using garments that have been forgotten to make beautiful things. And it just takes like it's an overwhelming industry. And so that way you're supporting local artisans who are paying themselves and their workers fairly. And you're also supporting their creative endeavors as well. Also just kind of normalizing buying secondhand. I think that's a tough one, but I think secondhand is the future as well. So I think we need to kind of turn away from constantly buying new things for one another. So those are some of my ideas.
I guess some of my ideas are a little bit specific to like us and not necessarily like the average like passerby. But I'm definitely gonna make it a goal of mine next year to like network more with local businesses and people who are like environmentally minded and conscious and like taking steps to like have things change. Cause like talking to you guys today, it's nice meeting people who are like all in their own industry, but we all still have the same like ethos of sustainability in mind. So even though like you're in fashion and like you do like the story of things, and I'm like a candle maker, like we also have that like that ethos of wanting to make our community more sustainable in different ways. So if like you wanted to host like a clothes swap next year or something, like I've actually helped out and hosted a clothes swap when I was living in London. And I would love to like help do that with you. I actually know even a couple of businesses that might be willing to host it. And things like that. Like, I don't know if you guys are all in the DMV area, but I think at least 2 of you have mentioned being here. So that's definitely something I want to do, like connecting to people who are already doing this, because I think we're more powerful together. But I also want to just like keep meeting people who aren't necessarily into sustainability or who don't have the time to do it, because I feel like no one's against sustainability, but a lot of people are very uncomfortable with change. And more than anything, I feel like that's something that we can be like going up against. Like I vend candles a lot. I do like pop-ups and stuff. And it's always nice for me to be in like super Republican Virginia and having a bunch of people coming up to me, like being like, oh, these are recycled bottles. That's so cool. Like, and all this stuff. Cause it's like literally something that they don't think about all the time. Like sustainability isn't a thing out there. But it's just nice to be able to like help out and like spread the word and stuff like that. Oh, I'm so sorry. I might have to go. There's people in the store, but it was so nice to meet all of you.
Thank you so much.
Nice to meet you, Holly.
Nice to meet you. I'm gonna ask Rainey for your email and stuff because I would totally like to like follow up. And if you guys ever do this again, I would love to like be a part of it. But yeah, thanks for having me, like impromptu and stuff.
We love a good swap.
Yes, honestly, let's
We
do
do.
it.
Wish I could
Take
join.
care. Oh, are you in the UK still?
I'm on the West Coast on the other side.
Okay. Do a
Yeah.
close swap there. I'm sure they've got loads of t-shirts.
Yeah, my wife's-
There's a remake hub there.
Oh, there is? Oh, cool.
Yes.
I'll check it out.
Yeah. Yeah, do on all the coasts. Anyway, toodles, guys.
Take care.
Bye.
Well, thank you guys so much for this. It was great. Yeah, and I hope we can do it again soon. I am going to work on starting a video series for next year, highlighting some small local businesses in DC to kind of interview them and ask them how they got started, to kind of further this idea of what does the circular economy look like beyond just bottle bills and plastic bans. But so this won't end now, it'll continue until next year. But yeah, thank you guys so much for coming.